January 14th, 1944. RAF, Horsham St Faith, Norfolk, England. Staff Sergeant Ernest D. Gould stood beneath the wing of a P-47D-10 Thunderbolt, examining equipment he had never seen before on a production fighter. A 15-gallon tank mounted just aft of the cockpit, lines running to the engine's intake manifold. Technical orders from Republic Aviation that contradicted everything he understood about how engines were supposed to work. The system was called anti-detonation injection. Water mixed with methanol or ethanol sprayed directly into the supercharger intake under extreme combat conditions. The manual said it would increase power by approximately 200 horsepower. What the manual did not say was that achieving that power required adjustments the Army Air Forces had not officially authorized. What it definitely did not mention was that mechanics like Gould, working with factory technical representatives who understood the R2800 engine's true capabilities, were about to rewrite the tactical rules of air combat over Europe. This was not about following procedures. This was about survival. German Focke-Wulf 190 fighters had terrorized American bomber formations for months, slashing through escort fighters that could not climb fast enough to intercept them. The P-47 Thunderbolt, despite its massive size and powerful engine, climbed to 30,000 feet in 20 agonizing minutes. The Focke-Wulf needed only 14. In those 6 minutes, hundreds of bomber crew members died. Gould and thousands of crew chiefs like him across dozens of fighter groups were about to solve a problem that Republic Aviation's engineers, the Army Air Force's acquisition bureaucracy, and Pratt & Whitney's official specifications had failed to address. They would do it by pushing engines beyond their rated limits, by adjusting systems in ways technical manuals explicitly forbade, by trusting their own judgment over distant authorities who had never faced a Focke-Wulf at 25,000 feet. The modifications they pioneered in January 1944 would transform the European air war. They would enable P-47 pilots to climb faster, fight higher, and survive longer than anyone had thought possible. They would prove that sometimes the difference between victory and defeat comes down to a mechanic who knows his engine better than the people who designed it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. October 1943, 8th Air Force Headquarters, High Wycombe, England. The statistical analysis was undeniable and terrifying. Since August, when the 8th Air Force had intensified its daylight bombing campaign against German industrial targets, loss rates had climbed to unsustainable levels. On August 17th, 60 B-17 bombers had been lost, attacking Schweinfurt and Regensburg. On October 14th, another 60 B-17 seconds were destroyed over Schweinfurt. The problem was not German anti-aircraft fire. The problem was Focke-Wulf 190 fighters attacking bomber formations at altitudes where American escort fighters struggled to maintain formation, let alone pursue attackers. The tactical situation was brutally simple. B-17 and B-24 bombers cruised at altitudes between 22,000 and 28,000 feet. At those altitudes, where the air was thin and cold, they were vulnerable to fighter attack from above. German controllers positioned Focke-Wulf 190 formations at 30,000 feet or higher. The German fighters dove on bomber formations, made a single high-speed pass, then climbed back to altitude before American escorts could react. The P-47 Thunderbolt, which had entered combat in April 1943, was supposed to solve this problem. Republic Aviation had designed the aircraft specifically for high-altitude interception. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, fed by a massive turbo supercharger installation in the rear fuselage, theoretically produced maximum power at 27,000 feet. The fighter's service ceiling exceeded 40,000 feet. No other American fighter could operate effectively at such altitudes. But theory and combat reality were proving to be very different things. The P-47's initial climb performance was disastrous. From takeoff to 30,000 feet required approximately 20 minutes. A Messerschmitt Bf 109G needed 11 minutes. A Focke-Wulf 190A needed 14 minutes. In a bomber escort mission, Those minutes were the difference between life and death. American fighter groups took off from bases in England and climbed to altitude while crossing the English Channel and the coast of occupied Europe. German controllers watched on radar as the formations assembled. They positioned their fighters above the expected bomber altitude and waited. By the time P-47 seconds reached 28,000 or 30,000 feet, the bomber formations they were supposed to protect had already been under attack for 10 minutes. The tactical disadvantage was compounded by another problem. Even when P-47 seconds reached high altitude, they struggled to maintain formation with bombers. The bomber stream flew at indicated airspeeds between 160 and 180 miles per hour. P-47 seconds, heavy and optimized for high-speed performance, wanted to fly much faster. Throttling back to maintain formation position required precise engine management. Slight variations in power settings caused fighters to drift out of position. Formation leaders could not slow down without losing airspeed margin. Wingmen could not speed up without overshooting. The result was a ragged, inefficient escort formation that provided inadequate coverage and exhausted pilots who spent more energy maintaining position than watching for enemy fighters. Fighter group commanders understood the problem's source. The P-47's Pratt & Whitney R280021 engine produced approximately 2,000 horsepower at rated conditions. That power was adequate for high-altitude cruise and combat at altitude. It was inadequate for rapid climb from sea level to combat altitude while carrying full fuel load, ammunition, and external tanks. Republic Aviation knew this. The company had been testing improved propeller designs since mid-1943. Hamilton Standard and Curtiss-Wright were developing new broad-chord propellers, nicknamed paddle blades, with significantly improved efficiency. But propeller development took time. Manufacturing and distribution took more time. Field retrofits required even more time. While engineers refined propeller blade designs in wind tunnels in Connecticut, bomber crews were dying over Germany. Pratt & Whitney had a solution. The company had been developing water methanol injection systems since 1938. Engineers Arthur Smith and Donald Hersey had patented the concept. The principle was elegantly simple. Spray a mixture of water and alcohol into the engine's intake manifold under high boost conditions. The water absorbed heat from compression, lowering intake air temperature and allowing higher boost pressure without detonation. The alcohol prevented freezing at altitude and added minimal combustible energy. The result was a significant power increase, approximately 200 to 300 horsepower for short periods. Pratt & Whitney had tested water injection extensively on the R2800 engine. The system worked. It was reliable. It required only a small tank, simple plumbing, and a switch in the cockpit. By mid-1943, Pratt & Whitney was ready to put the system into production. The Army Air Forces approved water injection for the P-47D starting with the -10 production block, P-47D10RE. Fighters began reaching England in late December 1943 and early January 1944. The 56th Fighter Group received theirs in January. The 355th Fighter Group received theirs in February. Other groups followed through the spring. Each P-47D10 carried a 15-gallon water methanol tank mounted behind the cockpit. The pilot controlled the system with a toggle switch on the instrument panel. When activated, the system sprayed the mixture into the supercharger intake through an adjustable nozzle. Technical manuals specified operating procedures. Water injection was authorized for a maximum of 5 minutes during combat emergency conditions. The system would increase manifold pressure from 56 inches of mercury to approximately 65 inches. Engine power would increase from 2,000 horsepower to 2,300 horsepower. Pilots were instructed to use water injection only at altitudes below 15,000 feet during climb or during combat, when maximum power was required for brief periods. The system was not to be used during normal operations. Overuse would damage the engine. These restrictions made sense from an engineering standpoint. The R280021 engine was rated at specific power levels for specific conditions. Exceeding those ratings risked detonation, overheating, and mechanical failure. The Army Air Forces could not afford to lose fighters to engine failures caused by unauthorized operation. Maintenance personnel were explicitly instructed not to modify or adjust water injection systems beyond specified parameters, but the restrictions also meant the system provided less benefit than it potentially could. Pilots who used water injection conservatively during climb gained perhaps 2 or 3 minutes in their climb to 30,000 feet. That improvement was noticeable but not decisive. German fighters still held the altitude advantage. They still attacked from above. They still escaped before American fighters could pursue. The real potential of water injection would only be realized when crew chiefs stopped following the technical manuals and started experimenting. In January 1944, as P-47D-10 fighters reached operational squadrons, that experimentation began. It began quietly. It began without official authorization, and it began to change the war. RAF Horsham St. Faith, England, housed the 56th Fighter Group, the 8th Air Force's most successful P-47 unit. The group had been operational since April 1943. Its pilots had destroyed more enemy aircraft than any other P-47 group. Its maintenance personnel were among the most experienced in the theatre. They had learned through 10 months of combat operations which procedures worked and which did not. They had developed modifications and improvements through trial and error. They understood their aircraft better than the technical representatives who visited from Republic Aviation. When the first P-47D-10 seconds arrived with water injection systems, the 56th's crew chiefs immediately recognized both the system's potential and its limitations. The water-methanol mixture worked as advertised, but the power increase was constrained by manifold pressure limits. 65 inches of mercury was better than 56, but the turbo-supercharger installation could deliver more boost pressure if the wastegate control system was adjusted properly. The wastegate was a valve that controlled exhaust gas flow to the turbo-supercharger. Open the wastegate, and exhaust gas bypassed the turbine, reducing boost pressure. Close the wastegate, and more exhaust gas drove the turbine faster, increasing boost pressure. The P-47's wastegate was controlled automatically by a governor that sensed manifold pressure. When manifold pressure reached the specified limit, the governor opened the wastegate to prevent overboosting. This system worked well for normal operations. It prevented pilots from accidentally damaging engines, but it also prevented pilots from accessing the full power the turbo-supercharger system could theoretically provide. If the wastegate governor could be adjusted to allow slightly higher manifold pressure before opening the wastegate, the engine would produce more power. The adjustment was simple mechanically, a few turns of a screw on the governor, but it was explicitly forbidden by technical manuals. Adjusting wastegate governors risked engine damage if pilots exceeded safe boost pressure. The Army Air Forces maintained strict control over engine operating parameters, precisely to prevent field modifications that might cause failures. In January 1944, Pratt and Whitney sent technical representatives to England to support the introduction of water injection systems. These factory representatives understood the R2800 engine's capabilities better than anyone. They had seen test data. They knew what the engine could actually produce under various conditions. They also understood that combat requirements sometimes differed from peacetime testing protocols. One of these technical representatives visited the 56th Fighter Group in January. His name has been lost to history. What he taught the 56th's crew chiefs has not. He showed them how to adjust wastegate governors. Not dramatically, not recklessly, but enough to allow manifold pressure to reach 68 or 70 inches of mercury with water injection, instead of the authorized 65. The adjustment required understanding. The engine would tolerate higher boost pressure only when water injection was active. The water cooled intake temperatures enough that detonation remained within safe limits. Without water injection, running 70 inches of manifold pressure would destroy the engine within minutes. Pilots had to understand this. They could use the higher boost settings only when water injection was flowing. They could use it only for brief periods. And they had to monitor cylinder head, temperatures and manifold pressure constantly. Staff Sergeant Ernest D. Gould, crew chief for Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson's P-47, learned these techniques from the Pratt & Whitney representative. Gould was an experienced mechanic who had been with the 56th since its formation. He had maintained Johnson's previous aircraft, keeping them operational through months of combat. He understood that modifications that improved performance also increased risk. He also understood that the risk of not making the modifications was greater. German fighters were killing American bomber crews because American fighters could not climb fast enough to intercept them. If adjusting a wastegate governor could give his pilot an edge that saved lives, Gould would adjust it. He made the modifications carefully. He tested the engine on the ground, monitoring manifold pressure and temperature. He briefed Johnson on the new capabilities and the limitations. Then he watched as Johnson flew the modified P-47 for the first time. The performance difference was immediately obvious. With water injection active and wastegate adjustment allowing higher boost pressure, Johnson's P-47 climbed at approximately 3,200 feet per minute at 10,000 feet. That was 400 feet per minute faster than standard P-47 seconds without water injection. Over a climb from 10,000 to 30,000 feet, that meant reaching combat altitude nearly 3 minutes faster. 3 minutes did not sound like much. But in combat at 500 miles per hour, 3 minutes meant 25 miles of distance. 3 minutes meant the difference between intercepting a German formation before it reached the bombers or watching helplessly as enemy fighters dove through the bomber stream. 3 minutes meant survival. Johnson was impressed enough that he briefed other pilots in the squadron. Word spread through the group. Other crew chiefs asked Gould how he had made the modifications. The Pratt & Whitney technical representative, seeing that experienced maintainers understood the risks and benefits, quietly shared the technique with other crew chiefs. Within weeks, dozens of P-47 seconds in the 56th Fighter Group were flying with adjusted wastegate governors. The modifications remained unofficial. Technical orders had not changed. The Army Air Forces had not authorized higher boost pressure, but combat results spoke for themselves. Pilots who had struggled to maintain formation with bombers at altitude now found they could climb faster, fight at higher altitudes, and pursue German fighters who had previously escaped. The 56th's kill ratios improved. Bomber loss rates on missions they escorted decreased. Nobody asked questions about wastegate adjustments. The practice spread to other fighter groups. Crew chiefs shared techniques. Pratt & Whitney representatives, seeing that modifications were being done carefully by experienced personnel, stopped discouraging them. By spring 1944, hundreds of P-47 seconds were flying with wastegate adjustments that allowed higher than authorized boost pressure when water injection was active. Republic Aviation became aware of the field modifications. Instead of prohibiting them, the company quietly adjusted specifications on new production aircraft. Later production blocks had wastegate governors set to allow slightly higher manifold pressure with water injection. The official specifications never changed in published manuals, but the aircraft left the factory ready to use the higher power settings that field experience had proven safe and effective. The combination of water injection and wastegate adjustment represented only part of the performance improvement story. In late 1943 and early 1944, another modification arrived that would multiply the effectiveness of both systems. Hamilton Standard delivered the first production broadchord propellers in December 1943. These paddle blade propellers, as pilots called them, featured wider chord dimensions than standard propellers. The increased blade area improved efficiency at all speeds, but particularly during climb. Where standard propellers had struggled to convert engine power into thrust at high power settings, paddle blades absorbed the additional power and translated it into faster acceleration and climb. The 56th Fighter Group received paddle blade propellers in January 1944. At the same time, they received P-47D 10 seconds with water injection. The timing was fortunate. Water injection provided more power. Wastegate adjustments allowed even more power. Paddle blade propellers used that power efficiently. Combined, the three improvements transformed the P-47's weakest characteristic into a competitive advantage. Standard P-47Cs, and early P-47Ds had climbed to 30,000 feet in approximately 20 minutes. They could sustain approximately 2,000 feet per minute at sea level, decreasing as altitude increased. At 15,000 feet, climb rate dropped to approximately 1,500 feet per minute. By 25,000 feet, they managed perhaps 1,000 feet per minute. Pilots described the experience as hanging on the propeller, watching German fighters accelerate away. P-47D 10 seconds with water injection, adjusted wastegates, and paddle blade propellers climbed at 3,200 feet per minute at 10,000 feet with water injection active. Even at 20,000 feet, they sustained 2,500 feet per minute. To 30,000 feet required approximately 15 minutes from brake release. That was 5 minutes faster than earlier P-47 models. It was competitive with Focke-Wulf 190A models. It meant American escort fighters could reach bomber altitude before German interceptors made their first attacks. The psychological impact was as significant as the tactical improvement. P-47 pilots who had felt defensively inadequate against Focke-Wulf 190s suddenly found themselves in competitive machines. They could climb with the enemy. They could fight at the enemy's preferred altitudes. They could pursue German fighters who had previously escaped untouched. Robert Johnson flew his modified P-47D5, serial number 42-8461, which he named Lucky, from February through March 1944. He achieved 21 of his eventual 27 victories in that aircraft. Johnson later described Lucky as the finest P-47 he ever flew. He credited his crew chief, Pappy Gould, with the aircraft's exceptional performance. Gould had not only adjusted the wastegate governor, he had also meticulously prepared the airframe. Every panel joint was sanded smooth. The entire aircraft was waxed to reduce skin friction. These aerodynamic refinements, combined with engine modifications, made Lucky measurably faster than standard P-47 seconds. Johnson estimated Lucky could reach 470 miles per hour, true airspeed at 32,000 feet, approximately 20 miles per hour faster than specification. In interviews years later, Johnson described the sensation of activating water injection with the adjusted wastegate settings. The manifold pressure gauge would climb to 72 inches of mercury. The headrest would slam into his shoulders as acceleration threw him backward. The power was intoxicating and dangerous. Johnson used it sparingly, understanding that sustained operation at such power levels would destroy the engine. But for brief periods during combat, when he needed maximum performance to pursue a German fighter or escape from a disadvantageous position, the power was available. Johnson was not alone in exploiting these modifications. Francis Gabreski, the 8th Air Force's second-ranking ace, flew similarly modified P-47 seconds. So did hundreds of other pilots in the 56th Fighter Group and other units that adopted the field modifications. The impact on combat effectiveness was measurable and significant. In March 1944, the 8th Air Force launched Big Week, a coordinated series of attacks against German aircraft manufacturing facilities. For 6 days, from February 20th through February 25th, American bombers struck targets deep in Germany. Fighter escort was critical. P-47 groups flew maximum effort missions, providing penetration escort, target area support, and withdrawal coverage. The 56th Fighter Group destroyed more enemy aircraft during Big Week than any other P-47 unit. Between February 20th and March 9th, the group shot down 112 German fighters. The group's pilots attributed much of their success to improved aircraft performance that allowed them to engage German fighters on more equal terms. Colonel Hubert Zemke, the 56th's commanding officer, later wrote that the combination of water injection and propeller improvements had transformed the P-47 from a defensive escort fighter into an offensive weapon capable of dominating German interceptors at altitude. The field modifications that had begun as unauthorized experiments became accepted practice throughout the 8th Air Force's P-47 groups. By April 1944, water injection was standard on all new P-47D aircraft reaching England. Wastegate adjustment techniques had spread throughout maintenance units. Paddle blade propellers were being retrofitted to earlier P-47 models as production caught up with demand. But the improvements came with costs and risks. Engines operated at higher temperatures and pressures wore faster. Cylinder head cracking increased, valve failures became more common, oil consumption rose, maintenance personnel found themselves performing more frequent engine changes. Some engines failed catastrophically when pilots exceeded safe operating limits. In February 1944, several P-47s experienced engine failures after pilots used water injection too aggressively. One aircraft exploded in mid-air when detonation destroyed the engine. The pilot parachuted to safety but lost his fighter. Another pilot barely reached England after his engine seized from overheating. These incidents prompted renewed emphasis on pilot discipline and proper water injection use. The Army Air Forces issued updated guidance emphasizing that water injection remained an emergency power system for brief use only. Technical orders specified maximum 5-minute operation. Pilots were instructed to monitor cylinder head temperatures constantly and reduce power immediately if temperatures approached limits. Maintenance personnel were reminded that wastegate adjustments, while tolerated in the field, were not officially authorized and should be performed only by experienced mechanics who understood engine limitations. Despite these cautions, the modifications continued. The tactical advantage they provided was too significant to abandon because of increased maintenance requirements or occasional failures. Fighter groups accepted that engines would wear faster and require more frequent replacement. They accepted that some pilots would push systems beyond safe limits and experience failures. The alternative, returning to the inadequate climb performance of early P-47 models, was unacceptable. German pilots noticed the change in P-47 performance during spring 1944. Focke-Wulf 190 pilots, who had dominated American escorts through autumn and winter 1943, found themselves facing more aggressive opponents who could climb to altitude quickly and maintain high-speed combat at 30,000 feet. German tactical reports from April 1944 noted that American P-47 seconds were achieving higher operational altitudes than previously observed and were demonstrating improved acceleration and climb performance. Luftwaffe intelligence officers speculated that the Americans had introduced a new fighter variant or had made significant engine improvements. They were partially correct. The P-47D-10 with water injection represented an improvement over earlier models. But the real performance gains came from field modifications that German intelligence never identified. The modifications were too subtle, too distributed across hundreds of aircraft, and too much the result of individual crew chief initiative to be detected through normal intelligence analysis. By June 1944, when the Allied invasion of Normandy commenced, P-47 groups were flying aircraft that bore little resemblance in performance to the P-47Cs that had entered combat 15 months earlier. Climb rate had improved by approximately 40%. High-altitude acceleration was measurably better. Engine power at combat settings had increased by nearly 15%. These improvements came not from revolutionary design changes but from incremental field modifications, from mechanics who understood their engines, and from pilots who learned to use new capabilities within safe limits. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. The technical evolution of the P-47 through field modifications represented a broader pattern in American military aviation during World War II. Official specifications and technical manuals provided baseline performance figures and operating procedures. But combat experience revealed capabilities and techniques that formal testing had not discovered. The gap between what engineers thought aircraft could do and what they actually could do under combat conditions was often significant. Closing that gap required trusting the judgment of maintenance personnel and pilots who worked with the equipment daily. The Army Air Force's willingness to tolerate unauthorized field modifications demonstrated institutional flexibility that contributed significantly to American air superiority over Europe. Other air forces, particularly the Luftwaffe, maintained stricter control over aircraft modifications and engine operating parameters. German maintenance manuals specified exact procedures and prohibited unauthorized adjustments. The Luftwaffe's centralized command structure made field innovation difficult. Mechanics who improvised solutions risked disciplinary action. This rigid approach had advantages. It ensured standardization across units. It prevented inexperienced personnel from making dangerous modifications, but it also meant the Luftwaffe lost the performance improvements that American mechanics achieved through experimentation and experience. German pilots flew Focke-Wulf 190A8 aircraft in mid-1944 that performed almost identically to the 190A4 seconds they had flown in 1943. The BMW 801 engine's specifications had not changed, operating procedures had not changed, performance had not changed. Meanwhile, P-47 seconds had improved dramatically. American maintenance culture emphasized practical problem-solving over procedural compliance. Crew chiefs were encouraged to find solutions that worked, even if those solutions bent regulations. Officers who commanded fighter groups understood that mechanics who kept aircraft flying and improved performance should be supported, not punished for technical manual violations. This culture originated partially from necessity. The rapid expansion of the Army Air Forces during 1942 and 1943 meant many maintenance personnel had limited formal training. They learned by doing, by experimenting, by sharing knowledge with experienced mechanics. The culture also reflected American industrial traditions that valued individual initiative and practical innovation. The men who became aircraft mechanics in 1942 had often worked in automotive repair shops, farm equipment maintenance, or similar fields where improvisation was expected. They brought those attitudes to military service. In April, the number exceeded 600. In May, it reached 700. The P-47 accounted for a significant portion of these victories. By war's end, P-47 seconds had destroyed more enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat than any other American fighter type in Europe. The total exceeded 3,700 confirmed victories. That achievement resulted from multiple factors, including numerical superiority, experienced pilots, and German fuel shortages. But it also reflected the fact that P-47 seconds in late 1944 and 1945 were measurably better aircraft than P-47 seconds in early 1943, largely due to field modifications and improvements that originated with mechanics like Ernest Gould. The specific performance numbers documented the transformation. Standard P-47D models tested in June 1944, using upgraded 44-1 fuel and water injection, achieved 65 inches of mercury manifold pressure and climbed at 3,200, 60 feet per minute at 10,000 feet. Without water injection at standard boost settings, the same aircraft climbed at 2,330 feet per minute. That represented a 44% improvement in climb rate from water injection alone. Field-modified aircraft with adjusted wastegate governors achieved even higher performance. Robert Johnson's Lucky reportedly sustained 72 inches of mercury manifold pressure with water injection, approximately 10% higher than authorized settings. That translated to additional power and climb performance that official test data did not reflect. The improvements came at significant cost in engine longevity. R280021 and R280059 engines operated at authorized power settings typically reached time between overhaul of 400 to 500 hours. The Army Air Forces recognized that combat experience revealed capabilities and techniques that peacetime testing could not anticipate. Post-war technical manuals incorporated more flexibility for field adjustments. Maintenance training emphasized understanding systems rather than memorizing procedures. The philosophy that experienced maintainers should have authority to make modifications based on operational necessity became standard practice. Modern military aviation retains this approach. Aircraft technical orders specify approved procedures and parameters, but experienced maintenance personnel understand that combat requirements sometimes demand creative solutions. When those solutions prove effective and safe, they often become officially sanctioned modifications or incorporated into future aircraft designs. The men who developed these techniques received limited recognition for their contributions. Crew chiefs like Ernest Gould were not awarded medals for adjusting wastegate governors. They received no public acknowledgement for the hundreds of hours they spent maintaining aircraft and implementing improvements. Their work was considered routine maintenance, not innovation worthy of special recognition. Robert Johnson, whose victories in Lucky brought him fame and the Distinguished Service Cross, always credited his crew chief for his aircraft's exceptional performance. In his autobiography and subsequent interviews, Johnson emphasized that he had the finest aircraft in the 8th Air Force because he had the finest crew chief. Johnson understood that his success depended on Gould's skill and initiative as much as his own flying ability. But Johnson's generosity in crediting his crew chief was exceptional among pilots. Most accepted superior aircraft performance without considering the unauthorized modifications and extra effort that produced it. The technical representatives from Pratt & Whitney who shared wastegate adjustment techniques with maintenance personnel also received no recognition. Their names were not recorded in official histories. Their contributions were mentioned in no after-action reports. They were doing their jobs, supporting combat operations, solving problems. That they chose to share knowledge that contradicted official procedures was seen as pragmatic rather than remarkable. Yet their willingness to trust experienced maintainers with information about engine capabilities that exceeded authorized specifications was critical to achieving the performance improvements that helped win air superiority over Europe. In the larger narrative of World War II aviation, the P-47 story is often overshadowed by the P-51 Mustang's longer range and higher speed. The Mustang replaced the P-47 bomber escort roles during late 1944 and achieved greater fame in popular memory. But during the critical period from spring 1944 through D-Day and beyond, when the 8th Air Force was destroying the Luftwaffe's fighter force in preparation for invasion, P-47 seconds, equipped with water injection and field modifications, performed the majority of escort missions and achieved the majority of aerial victories. The modifications that made this possible represented a distinctly American approach to military technology. Official specifications provided a starting point. The culture that enabled this innovation was as important as the technical modifications themselves. The willingness to tolerate controlled risk, to trust experienced personnel, to value results over procedural compliance, created an environment where improvement was constant and adaptation was rapid. The German military, despite superior engineering in many areas, struggled to match this adaptive capability. German aircraft in 1945 performed similarly to German aircraft in 1943. American aircraft in 1945 were dramatically better than American aircraft in 1943, largely because of incremental improvements like water injection, modifications that originated in the field rather than in engineering offices. The legacy of the P-47's performance transformation through field modifications extends beyond World War II. Modern military aviation maintenance doctrine emphasizes understanding systems, identifying improvements, and implementing solutions at the organizational level. The trust between pilots and maintainers that characterized successful fighter squadrons in World War II remains fundamental to modern squadron culture. Pilots trust that maintainers will do whatever is necessary to provide the best possible aircraft. Maintainers understand that their work directly impacts combat outcomes and pilot survival. This mutual dependence creates a relationship where innovation and initiative are valued and supported. The specific technique of water methanol injection that transformed the P-47's performance in 1944 became standard on high-performance piston engines through the end of World War II. German aircraft adopted similar systems. British aircraft used it extensively. Post-war racing aircraft used water injection to achieve record-breaking performance. The principle that temporarily increasing engine power through intake cooling remained relevant even as jet engines replaced piston engines. Modern turbofan engines use water injection for short-field takeoffs under high-temperature conditions, continuing a practice that P-47 mechanics pioneered 80 years ago. Ernest Gould survived the war and returned to civilian life. His subsequent career is unknown. He received no special recognition for his work, maintaining Robert Johnson's aircraft, or for implementing the field modifications that improved P-47 performance. His contribution to American air superiority over Europe was invisible in official records, mentioned only in Johnson's autobiography and a few interviews with pilots who remembered their crew chiefs. Robert Johnson survived 91 combat missions, achieved 27 confirmed victories, and became one of America's most celebrated fighter pilots. After the war, he worked for Republic Aviation as a test pilot and engineering liaison, providing feedback from combat experience that influenced post-war fighter design. Johnson died in December 1998 at age 78. Throughout his life, he maintained that his success as a fighter pilot depended on the skill and dedication of his crew chiefs, particularly Pappy Gould. The P-47 Thunderbolt remained in American military service until 1954. Foreign air forces operated P-47 seconds into the 1960s. The aircraft's reputation for ruggedness, heavy firepower, and effectiveness in ground attack roles made it popular with nations that needed capable fighter bombers. But the P-47's most important contribution to air warfare was demonstrating that official specifications represent minimum capability, not maximum potential. Aircraft can be improved through field modifications when maintainers understand their systems and are empowered to implement improvements. The mechanics who adjusted wastegate governors on P-47 seconds in England during winter 1944 proved this principle. They showed that sometimes the most important innovations come not from engineering offices, but from the flight line, from the people who work with equipment daily and understand what it can really do. Their legacy is every aircraft that performs better than its specifications suggest, every modification that originates with maintainers rather than engineers, every improvement that results from trusting the judgment of experienced personnel rather than rigidly following regulations. The story of how mechanics made P-47 seconds climb faster by adjusting systems the Army Air Forces had not authorized is ultimately a story about American military culture. It is about empowering people closest to problems to develop solutions. It is about valuing practical results over procedural compliance. It is about understanding that innovation happens everywhere, not just in designated places, and recognizing that the sergeant maintaining an aircraft on a muddy airfield in England might solve problems that PhD engineers in Connecticut had not considered. In the end, the modifications that transformed P-47 performance were not about fuel mixtures or wastegate adjustments or propeller designs. They were about trust. Trust that experienced maintainers would make good decisions. Trust that pilots would use new capabilities responsibly. Trust that when people understand their equipment and care about outcomes, they will find ways to improve performance and accomplish missions that official specifications suggest are impossible. That trust, more than any technical modification, and was the secret weapon that helped win air superiority over Europe and demonstrated that sometimes the best engineering comes not from textbooks, but from muddy flight lines, where mechanics, who know better than the manual says so, are empowered to prove it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.